You can find our podcasts, this one and previous and future, on our John Howard Society of PEI YouTube channel. And there's also information on our website. So I am back again as the host, Josh Constantinou, Coordinated Access Coordinator for the John Howard Society. And we have Conor.
Yeah, good morning, Josh, and everybody listening. I'm Conor Mullin, President of the John Howard Society of PEI.
And our special guest today that we're excited to have joining us is Danya.
Hello.
Do you want to introduce yourself and where you're at there, Danya?
Sure. So I'm Danya O'Malley. I'm Executive Director of PEI Family Violence Prevention Services. People are probably most familiar with our emergency shelter, Anderson House, but we do a lot of other stuff besides that.
Awesome. Thank you. And we will
hear about it.
Yeah, that's right. We'll certainly dig into all of those details a little further along here. Okay, so we did, as we sort of mentioned off air before we jumped on here, we did meet a couple of weeks back to do this. So there may not be a ton of new updates, but we'll spend some time talking about the ones that have occurred. So I'll open it up to you, Conor, if there's anything you want to start us off with.
Sure. So like you say, Josh, we were here just 2 weeks ago. And as I think I mentioned on the last podcast, the board of directors doesn't meet over the summer. So I don't have really a whole ton of new updates from the board. Something I did want to raise here, because today is the start of Pride Month, is to note that at the John Howard Society a few years ago, we started an initiative in collaboration with Pride PEI to assist people with applying for record expungements under the Historically Unjust Convictions Act. So basically what this is that back in the prior to 1969, when homosexuality was illegal in Canada, there were a number of criminal code offenses that people could be charged with, things like buggery, indecent exposure, indecent acts, gross indecency, things like that, that basically were crimes for being gay. Parliament has recently that was all decriminalized in 1969. But Parliament in the last couple of years recognized that there are still probably a lot of people out there that have these convictions on their criminal records, and that is unjust because it was criminalizing people for who they are. So there's been a process put in place for people to apply to have their criminal records expunged completely of those convictions. So at the John Howard Society, we do have a process in place to help people with that. So I know we're talking about, criminal convictions pre-1969. So a lot of people who suffer from that may be passed on at this point, but you can apply for a posthumous expungement for a loved one or an expungement for yourself. So if you or anyone that you know has a conviction like this on their record, or of somebody that does, or someone that's passed, reach out to us at the John Howard Society, and we are very happy to help get that expunged and do what we can to right a historic wrong.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
That's really nice.
Yeah, I didn't realize that that's still a thing. Like you said, I wouldn't have thought about the fact that that would be on someone's record at this point, because it's been, 5 decades, almost 6 at this point of, historically this has been out of the picture. But
yeah, I say a lot of people don't think about it, but there are still people alive that this applies to. And maybe even people that passed, but what you can do for a loved one is, even though they're passed, is to apply for that pardon for them, or that expungement for them posthumously, right? Which I think is kind of a nice gesture to be able to do. And there are probably a lot of people out there who have these convictions who maybe they haven't told anybody about it, or because they're probably back in the 1960s and beforehand, there probably would have been a lot of shame, unfortunately, attached to that, right? And just want to say there's no need to feel ashamed. And if you or someone or love suffered that injustice, we'll do what we can to make it right.
Yeah. No, and I like that thought process of, if somebody's passed on, they likely would have struggled and experienced a whole lot of stigma and hate and oppression during that time.
Absolutely.
So like you said, as
Yeah.
a tribute to that, to honor the challenges and trials that they went through, there's an opportunity to say, let's get that off the official record.
Yep.
Um,
Yeah. And there's a separate process, but also one that we can assist you with for people who were members of the Canadian military who maybe were dishonorably discharged or something along those lines. If their life, their sexual orientation came out, or they were charged with one of these offenses or something, people could have been discharged from military service, and there's also a process to deal with that as well.
That's fantastic. That's another spot where, even more so than the general public, it was scrutinized.
Absolutely, yeah.
Danya, anything to comment on that piece, or to bring up around family violence prevention services as it pertains to Pride?
Let's see. Well, firstly, I had no idea that you could expunge those things. I really like the word expunge. It's a very pleasing word. I didn't know that you could, I knew that you guys did the like sort of the record clearing just in general. But I didn't know that there was that specific program for those types of crimes. And you're right, it's a long time ago. Even if people are still alive, they might not be held back, employment wise, because of this crime when they're 80, but it's symbolic, and incredibly meaningful, and even posthumously, like to kind of right that wrong. I think it's really beautiful and very nice. So in terms of FVPS and Pride, we have a ton of queer employees, so we're involved in one way or another. Mostly we walk with the Feminist Pride banner, which is put together by the Advisory Council on the Status of Women. But I'm noticing more and more requests in my inbox to walk with other groups that we're very connected with. So I think I just got one today for the United Way, to walk with them, and various other groups that we have strong partnerships with. And so the united front, from the community groups is just wonderful, that they all see a role in it, and especially right now where there is the rumblings of so much hatred on PEI right now, as far as gender diversity and stuff like that. It really highlights why Pride is still important. When gay marriage came into being, and things were seeming fairly equal, I think a lot of people were like, why do we still need this? And it's like, we still need this, while trans people are still dying in overrepresented numbers in violent crimes, we still need this. And so it's the opportunity for visibility and celebration.
Yeah, and I think this is the 30th anniversary of the first ever Pride March on PEI. So think about that. This is something that only started within my lifetime, right? So it's like, I think, like you say, Daniel, like there's been a lot of progress, but there's still miles to go, right? So.
Yeah. Well, and it's funny you should say that. So this is true. The one that happened in 1994 then would have been the first one. And I marched in 1995.
Oh, wow.
And so I remember they had talked about the one the prior year had about 70 some people. And then the one in 95 had like 83 or 87. Like we'd gone up, by about 10 or more people. And so that was seen as a huge celebration. There was a very tiny collection of us that walked. There was a picture that was on the front page of the Guardian as a result of that. I had a friend who was incredibly distressed because she was not out to her family, and she was on the front page of the Guardian. And there were other people. I remember one of the two people who were walking with the banner at the very front. Her coworkers were out on their lunch break and ended up seeing her, and she felt very, like, kind of hadn't expected that, I guess. And so she was wondering how to handle that with work. Like, I remember those days where, you know, two people would live together and their parents would all think they were just roommates. Like that was usual. That was typical. I lived out in Alberta for a while, which is even more conservative. And I had a friend who was a junior high school teacher who was very closeted because she knew that if they knew that she was gay, that she would be fired. You know, this is not that long ago. Like, I was in my 20s. And so it's not that long ago that it was quite a bit different than it is now, although there's still much work to be done. But yeah, so I marched in 1995.
Wow.
That's
Yeah.
cool.
That's very cool. And it's interesting, like you say, just kind of getting back to this issue of like criminal, the record expungements. Like, imagine not only that fear that, your family's going to find out and what they're going to think and that you're going to get fired, you could lose your job, but that you're also going to be charged with a crime and criminalized for just
Yeah.
being who you are and loving who you love, right? So, I mean, it really is, like I say, a grave injustice, and one that I'm hoping we'll have the opportunity to help right. But like you say, that things have changed a lot, but that prejudice still exists for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a good point around the importance and the impact of the march and what it represents.
Yeah.
Like you said, Danya, I think it's easy to kind of lose sight of what it means and what it represents, and people just be like, "Oh, yeah, there's just another march going on," versus that push forward towards, being treated with respect and having the opportunity to be who you are and express who you are, and not be judged or ridiculed or experience some of the unfairness that happens just as a result of that.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. Anything else you wanted to add to that piece of our conversation, Connor, Don, Daniel? Open up to either of you before we move along.
No, I think that covers it for me.
I think it's, as far as sort of the wider hate sentiment that's happening now, it is so concerning to people in my line of work in the social justice field because, I mean, Canada traditionally has flip-flopped with a liberal versus a conservative premier. Like, we go back and forth. I mean, we kind of only have two parties really, in a way. And so the leadership has just gone back and forth. So we're due for a conservative prime minister, and unfortunately, it's looking like that is going to happen. And so people in the women's community and in the social justice community really worry about what the impact of that is going to be on marginalized groups. So right now we're in receipt of quite a bit of funds here on PEI as part of the National Action Plan to End Gender-Based Violence, and there are a lot of people working very hard behind the scenes to try to make sure that that money is sort of locked in a way that would be difficult to undo, or that it would be, politically like not advantageous for you to undo something that's helping victims. Because, if we remember from the Stephen Harper government, women's groups were defunded, they were undervalued, I didn't think we could have someone worse than Stephen Harper. And so it's upsetting to see, and this will have an impact on the LGBTQ community as well.
Yeah, there's a lot of trepidation from a lot of groups, as you say, in the social justice field. Say women's groups, victims groups, LGBTQ plus groups. The criminal justice field. There's a lot of trepidation about the results of the next federal election, for sure.
Yeah,
definitely. Okay, so aside from Pride, was there anything else you wanted to touch on, sort of from a board level, or?
We do have the John Howard Society of Canada's annual general meeting coming up in October. So we're just kind of preparing, looking forward to that. Obviously, we are a member society of the John Howard Society of Canada, which will be a good opportunity to get together with colleagues from across the country, learn what other John Howards are doing, what's worked for them, what hasn't worked for them, share what we're doing, because I think we're doing a lot of great work here on PEI, and just figure out ways that we can sort of move forward together to advance the causes of marginalized people in our communities.
Yeah, and that's in addition to the Atlantic meeting that we had spoken about last time, right?
That's right. Yeah. So we still have we're still hosting a meeting of the Atlantic region EDs in August this year, and we'll also have the ED from John Howard Canada down here as well. So again, always a great opportunity, as I say, to show off all the good work that we're doing and figure out ways that we can collaborate with our colleagues across the region and across the country.
Yeah, and I think that speaks to, we talk about collaboration. Last podcast, we spoke a bit about some of the partnerships. And so on the sort of ground level, there are these partnerships and collaboration. I think that's neat to see. Like, it goes all the way up the food chain to the very top of John Howard Canada.
Yep.
In terms of those meetings to come together and talk about what's working.
Absolutely. Say, none of us can do it alone, right? Like we all need collaboration, whether that's within the organization or with our community partners, right? But none of us is an island, and none of us can do it alone.
Yeah. No, that's awesome to see. And like you said, that chance to see what's going on across the country and what have other people tried and thought about that maybe we hadn't, and vice versa.
Absolutely.
So locally, in terms of programs, we talked a bit about the tax program last time. We're still waiting for a next one to be set. I suspect, as we sort of had a chat off the top there, summer puts a bit of a slowdown on that. So the next one may not be till September at this point. But we'll get some more information about that. We referenced last time that we got that Summerside office space and things are up and running there. Our veterans program continues to move forward.
Yeah, we're waiting on a firm launch date, but things are getting much closer to that being on all fours and ready to go. So we'll keep everyone updated about that, but we're very excited about that one.
Yes, it's coming.
It's coming.
Yeah. And I think that was kind of the follow-up items I had from last time in terms of programs. Was there any other programs or initiatives that you wanted to speak about or touch on?
There are a couple of things in the works at the board level, but they're a little too preliminary right now for me to really want to kind of say too much about them. Yeah. I'm hoping maybe by the fall we'll have something a little more definitive to talk about. So not at this stage, but stay tuned.
There you go. A little teaser for next episode. I like it. Okay. I think that's it on the John Howard side of things then, which means we'll turn it over to our guest of honor here, Danya, who you've already gotten some great information about, but we will now dig into FVPS. And Danya, the floor is yours to share a little bit about what your organization does and anything else you want.
Sure. So thanks very much. Thanks for having me. Interestingly, in some other parts of Canada, in some other provinces, there's a lot of contention. There's a bit of a clash between the homelessness sector and the domestic violence sector. And what's behind that is usually a competition for the same resources. And so there's a bit of push and pull between those two sectors. And I was surprised when I found that out when I started doing more things nationally, because here it's seen as one issue. Abuse causes homelessness, and homelessness can cause abuse. It's one issue, and a person fleeing violence at that moment is homeless. And so I love the collaboration that we have here. And I just kind of wanted to note that it's not that easy in other provinces sometimes to have the level of collaboration that we have here. So thanks for having me. So I'll sort of start with a bit about the organization, because I think a lot of people recognize our name and recognize, of course, Anderson House, which is definitely our flagship. But I think we do a lot more than people are aware of. So we started in 1981. Just with the emergency shelter. At the time, some community members started to notice that there were women who needed to flee violence and they didn't have anywhere to go. And so it was very grassroots. A group got together, they bought a house, they renovated it, and they started taking people in. And that's how we began. But we started to realize throughout those beginning years that there were a lot of people who needed our services but might not need shelter. And so perhaps someone was only contemplating leaving and hadn't left yet, and but wanted to speak with somebody. Or if someone maybe had left some time ago and needed some help with some of that healing work sort of down the road, and they didn't need shelter. And also, although we're a provincial shelter, and if we take people from all over the province, and if they can't get to us, we get them to us. It's not convenient if you work and your kids go to school in Alberton to come to a shelter in Charlottetown. And so for the most part, we wanted to be able to offer services to people in their home communities. And so that's when we started to open our outreach offices. So we have 4 outreach offices across the province, in O'Leary, Summerside, Charlottetown, and Montague. And we also see far more people through outreach than we do in the shelter. So in the shelter, we might have 50, 60, 70 families come through the shelter in a year, but we see about 300 or 400 families via outreach. And we find that our outreach caseloads in the rural areas are actually fairly heavy because there are fewer support services in those regions. And so we fill kind of a bigger role there than we might in some of the other, in the larger centers. And so our outreach offices opened throughout the 90s. And then we also have some housing as well. So we have some transitional housing. We have some units that we own. And then we also have units that are technically PEI housing units, but we get to select the tenant that goes in there. And I love this arrangement. This works very well for me because then we're not landlords. We don't deal with leases and snow removal and maintenance and all that, but we have that as a resource for our clients. And so I like that. And then a few years ago, maybe about 10 years ago now, we had the opportunity to take over operation of a building called SAS House, which is Services for Adult Survivors. It opened in the 90s, and it was a building originally dedicated to survivors of child sexual abuse, women and mother-led families. And slowly, they had their own board, they were their own organization, but we were approached by Canada Mortgage and Housing to ask if our board would sort of take over running that building, because they only had one board member and their mortgage needed renewing. And so we were essentially gifted a 9-unit apartment building, which we started running as permanent housing, which was the one thing we really lacked. We had some transitional housing units, but a lot of people, when they're leaving violence, it's very difficult to say to them, well, we have a unit for you for a year. And they're like, but then I have to move twice. And it's like, yes, I hear you on that point, but we have a unit for you for a year. And so to be able to have permanent housing as well in our list of what we can offer people was really wonderful, and not something that we would have achieved had that not happened. But CMHC was aware that we were running a similar building and would have experience doing all the things that they need you to do when you're subsidized through them and all of that. So the pandemic really impacted people and it impacted community groups, as you know. And one of the things that came from the pandemic is a real spotlight on abuse and violence. And so this is something that kind of started with the Me Too movement, and then the pandemic really pushed it ahead by a lot. And so the wonderful thing about that spotlight and that awareness and attention is that it has also come with resources. And so money is coming, again, like I just mentioned a bit ago, from the National Action Plan to End Gender-Based Violence and other various government initiatives, both federal and provincial. And so this has allowed us to do new and different things that we probably would have been doing all along had we had the resources to do it. But now we can. And so some of the new things that we have on the go is, a couple of years ago, we implemented services for men, both men who are victims of abuse and men who are perpetrators of abuse, which is a huge area of focus for me. I see that as true prevention. And so we started doing that. Most people who perpetrate violence as well have generally really terrible victim histories, usually as children. And so it takes healing and directed efforts in order to help someone to live differently and to lead to actual behavior change. And so it's work that I see as incredibly valuable. So we started doing that a couple of years ago, and the feedback is absolutely excellent. We have a lot of really good community partners in doing this work. And then most recently, in the last year, we've started offering targeted services for children and youth. And so before that, clients would often say, do you have anyone my kids can talk to? And it's like, no. But now we can say yes. And so my goal was to have wraparound care for families. I'm sure anybody who's used to hearing from me is like, oh my God, Danya, because I talk about this all the time over the last few months, is that I want wraparound care for families. I want, no matter who comes to us, I want to be able to tell them that we have a service for every other member of their family, because that's new. We have never had that before this year. And so it feels really good. And if you listen to what people want, it's what they want. Like a lot of people, some people want to leave their relationship and never return. And that's fine. And we'll help them do that. But a lot of people that you talk to, they want their relationship to stay intact. They just want the abuse to stop. And the shelter movement was always kind of built on the idea that bad men do bad things, avoid the bad men. And now we have a far more nuanced view of people who cause harm. And we understand that investing in people can bring change. And why would they change if nothing was invested in that change, right? And so that's why we're seeing things now like the therapeutic court happening with the province. And it's the understanding that incarceration alone is not going to lead to behavior change, especially of a problem of that nature. And so violence is a learned behavior, and it tends to be something that you have to unlearn. And the initial feedback of the therapeutic court as well is very positive. And I'm really, really happy to see this shift in terms of understanding the causes of violence and the ways out of it, the ways to prevent it.
That's fantastic. You gave us a lot to digest there.
Yeah, I know. Do you have any questions?
Yeah, it's an impressive overview. I don't even know if I'd call it an overview.
Yeah. I like what you're saying there, Danya, about sort of this change in perspective from, bad men cause abuse, so stay away from them, to this understanding that people who cause harm themselves have been caused harm, and
Yes.
how to deal with that. I know something that I used to see a lot in my day job as a defense lawyer is that when it came to domestic violence, those were the cases where most likely trials would never happen, because women would either not want to give statements or not show up to trial to testify, because I think there was this understanding that if they testify and their partner is convicted and maybe he goes to jail for a few months, he's going to get out eventually, probably worse off than he was before, and that things may be worse for her when he gets out. But now that we have this sort of new understanding, and like I say, the therapeutic court, we can move to a place where it's safer for women to report being abused and to kind of follow through with it, because rather than just this focus on incarceration, it's really a focus on dealing with those more deep-seated issues that kind of caused the abuse in the first place. So I really like that there's been that focus.
Yeah, me too. It is just wonderful, and it's what, like, if you want to protect women, this is the way to protect women. So a lot of people feel like, well, is it letting people off easy? Are they not being held accountable? If you're kind of giving their past, if you're saying this is what brought them to this point. And I really don't think so. Like the therapeutic court, firstly, is built around taking responsibility. And so you have to take responsibility for what you have done. And that's huge. That's hard to do. Some people never do that. And so I think that needs to be celebrated for sure. And then also with I call it compassionate accountability, right? Like acknowledging the terrible circumstances that brought you to the point that you're at, but you're an adult and you're responsible for your actions as an adult. And so it's a fine line to walk, but it's important because, you know, if you look at somebody who's caused harm over quite a period of time, they will have received lots of messages over those years that they are a lost cause, that they're worthless, that they're never going to change. Like there've probably been a number of negative messages. And you know, we look at parenting now and we know that if you want to grow good children, you invest in them. You know, you give them what they need. You help them along. You make sure that they have a path of hope and a path of success. And so with any kind of behavior change, you know, be it addiction, be it violence, like there has to be a sense of hope. There has to be a belief that you could do things differently. And if everyone's telling you that you're a lost cause, how is that going to happen? You know, a lot of people very much want to live differently. They don't want to hurt their family members. They don't want to be in this cycle of like breaking up and fighting and hurting one another. And they just don't have a blueprint on how to get there. They weren't given a blueprint. They weren't raised with a blueprint. And so the work that needs to happen in order to lead to that change, it's a possible thing. It just takes people investing in that and deciding that that's the direction we want to go. And so now we're going, and I'm very, very pleased.
And on that subject of accountability, I'm sure that for a lot of people, you know, who have this kind of trauma and whatnot in their past, it's probably harder for them to face that head on than it would be to say go to jail, right? Like in a lot of ways, going to jail might be what really lets somebody off easier if you don't force them to do that difficult internal work.
Yeah, I mean, that work is hard work. It's change is hard. And I think if people like really look upon their own lives and times that they've tried to change or do something that wasn't natural to them, you know, it's difficult. I mean, think of somebody like myself who does not enjoy exercise. You know, the times that I've had to make myself do something that's foreign and that's different, you know, it's like you're it's difficult. Change is very difficult, even if you're making a positive change. And so I think that acknowledging that that's not easy for people, and if they're taking that step, that's a really positive one. And the programming that they do. So for example, through clinical services with the province, the main domestic violence program is called Turning Point. And it's a wonderful program. It evaluated very, very positively. I participated in an evaluation of that program back in 2016, and I was really disappointed that the results of that evaluation were never made public. It was just internal to government. Because it evaluated so positively. So the evaluator looked at not only the numbers and saw that the reoffending rates for people who completed the program were massively lower. But also she did qualitative interviews with people who'd completed the program, and they spoke so sincerely about the skills that they gained and the insights into their own behavior. And you would read that evaluation and think, you know, we should resource that program 4 times over. Because it's very, very true. It's life-changing for people when they complete that programming.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic to hear that the program has been. I mean, it's a well-established program nationally. It's been around quite a long time, as far as I know. And I like what you said earlier about this idea of kind of sort of like we've chatted about switching this mentality to a more holistic approach. But particularly for individuals who are experiencing that violence, not just assuming that the best thing for them is to remove them from the situation, sometimes permanently, and say, okay, you know, it's not good to be around that person anymore, so we're going to help you by removing you completely and segregating you from that part of the community potentially, and reestablishing a new life. When you've pointed out, in some cases, reconciliation is truly what they want, and they need support moving forward on that.
Mm-hmm. I know, and so I've been encouraging these small changes, sort of as we go. Like throughout this journey of mine. I've been in this work for a long time, 16 years now. And so people often come to me with things like, I had somebody come to me and say that his daughter was dating somebody who was being pretty awful. Sort of that definitely like low level, ranging into abusive behavior. And he came to me and he's like, how do I get her away from him? And he otherwise quite liked the kid. And I said, well, don't push him out, pull him in. And he couldn't believe that I said that. And I said, talk to him. You have a good relationship with him. Tell him, in our family, we don't do this, and bring him in as opposed to pushing him out. And he was just, his mind was blown. And I said, it may not go the way you want it to, but you may not have success pushing him out either, and so why not give this a shot? And I think it was really surprising. I think he knew that the kid had been sort of largely unparented. And it's like, I think showing that, like holding him accountable, that you can't do this, but, stay around, just don't do these things. It was, I think, probably, I think it was a real turning point in his way of seeing things. And so it's not to say that we minimize or rationalize the things that people do and say, well, they've been harmed, so we understand. It's like they're still expected to live in a healthier way and respect those around them. And I think that accountability piece is important.
So Danya, as there's been this kind of shift away from like removing the victims of violence from situations and as kind of the knee-jerk response and more towards taking a more holistic wraparound approach, do you find that the need or the use of emergency shelter services has decreased, or how do you find that pattern over time?
Well, you could never tell in a housing crisis.
Right.
And so, I wouldn't have a clue because the housing crisis is just so what governs pretty much everything we do.
Yeah.
That it's hard to say. Like what I do notice is what's decreasing our numbers in the shelter when we go through periods that are quieter than others is the housing crisis. People don't want to leave to go to an emergency shelter because they know there isn't anywhere to go after that.
Right.
And so we have outreach workers who talk about having clients who are living with their ex, trying to stay each to their end of the house. It's keeping people in dangerous situations, and it's really just because there is nowhere to go.
Right.
And it's so difficult for people. And I was contacted just this week by somebody who really doesn't meet our mandate, but is sort of reaching out for help anywhere they can. And one of the things they mentioned was, well, I have a caseworker here and a caseworker here and a caseworker here. And it's like, when you're dealing with low housing stock, having case managers is important, but it doesn't make more units materialize. And so it's like I offered to kind of see if maybe we couldn't coordinate the efforts in this case, because there certainly are a lot of people involved, but the person remains unhoused. And so it's so challenging when we're dealing with the housing crisis. I don't know what your experience was at the beginning of the pandemic, but because we had no tourists and no post-secondary students, suddenly people were coming into the shelter and finding ongoing housing in like 3 or 4 days, and it was really quite surprising. Suddenly for those people with short-term rentals, they were renting them for monthly rates that were very reasonable. And it was like, I thought short-term rentals weren't the problem. But it suddenly became very, very easy for people to move on from emergency shelter. And it was sad to see what hope there is for people when there is, places to go in a very kind of expedient way.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point around the housing crisis driving some of that. And that was kind of my thought process when you mentioned COVID earlier, in the spotlight on the domestic violence piece was so many people staying together because of needing to be in the same space as the person that you were sort of quarantined with, or required to live with as part of your bubble. And so, like you've said, the housing crisis has kind of mimicked some of that, of forcing people into situations where they may otherwise make different choices.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really quite harsh, and you think it's bad in the city, and of course we have workers that are rural as well, and the rental options in the rural areas. Oh, it's just so challenging. And so, like with most of the rural areas, like if you don't have your own car and you don't have your own house, it's tremendously difficult.
And of course, yeah, the housing crisis, landlords can just afford to be so much more selective when there are so many people vying for housing. They can take the easiest tenants, right? The tenants who don't necessarily have the same issues as our client base, right? Or who can't afford to pay as high a rent as other people, right? And the landlords can kind of sit back and have their picking of who's the easiest tenant who will pay me the most, right? So it makes it very difficult to try and, in the line of work that we do, to try and get landlord engagement to take on, clients who have these sort of issues and who are low income and can't afford to pay, right? So it just, it makes it very difficult in that regard.
It is so hard. They can be very choosy. I remember back in, I think it was 2013 or 14, or maybe even earlier than that, 12 or 13, we had a 7% vacancy rate in Charlottetown because we had a whole lot of immigrants come from the PMP program. And then once their 2 years were up, a lot of them were then free to move to other areas of Canada. So they would go to, Toronto or Vancouver, where they had other relatives. And so we had a very quick boom in population, and then a whole bunch of people left. So a 7% vacancy rate. I remember they were renting to people with free first month's rent, no damage deposit, things like that, because the right tenant was the one willing to move in, was the one willing to sign a lease. And so nowadays, God forbid you look poor. God forbid you have, more than 2 kids. If you have too many or too few children, it's tremendously difficult to find housing. Single people with no kids, very difficult to find housing for.
And forget it if you have a pet.
Yeah, which, a lot of people do, especially people who've been through trauma, because of the very stabilizing effect that having a pet has. We want that. We want that comfort. We want that companionship. But then it's very, very difficult moving on if you don't have your own home.
Yeah.
So as we move towards kind of the end of our time here, Danya, I know you mentioned the wraparound services for family and having the ability to target youth and children now with your services as kind of your current next step that's already sounds like well underway. I wonder, in addition to that, is there anything else sort of in the works or that you want to share that's kind of in the plan for the next coming future?
Well, one of the things that we've been looking at is how to have more in-house mental health care for our clients. And so we had a few people on practicum from the UPEI Doctor of Psychology program doing some clinical work with our clients. But the clients that we have and the ones we were referring were typically our most complex. They were the ones that had the most complex mental health concerns. And so it's very difficult to then have someone who's here for such a short period of time. A student on practicum is, just a few months. And so we're kind of looking at what we can do in order to get those needs met and have that continuity. And so we have been sort of toying with the idea of having a social enterprise arm of the organization, where we have counselors who are able to do sort of fee-for-service work. And that fee-for-service work either facilitates free access for some of our clients, or it acts as a revenue stream for the organization. And so that's my that's my 2025 project.
That sounds very
Very
cool.
good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Certainly mental health services, therapeutic services, counseling services, all of that is hard to find. And then, like you said, the fee for service aspect that does allow you to get access to some quality individuals becomes a barrier when affordability and poverty play a part for folks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we thought it was ideal. You know, there are those who have the ability to pay either out of pocket or because they have insurance, and if we allow that work to fund work for people who don't have the ability to pay, it's just wonderful.
Fantastic. Okay. In terms of sort of the upcoming events, there's nothing too urgent. We touched on the upcoming point in time count a little bit last time. We have started as a community information and training sessions that'll be going on a monthly basis. So they're starting at the end of this month. We're also in the process of getting some information up on the John Howard Society of PEI website about it. So we'll have that up before the next time we do our podcast. And we'll be able to delve into some more details on that because we'll be another month or so closer to that becoming a reality of what we're up to.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Okay. Conor, Danya, anything else you wanted to share or say before we end our time here together today?
I just say as I always do. Anyone listening, please subscribe to the John Howard Society PEI YouTube page. Check us out on Facebook and like our Facebook page. Check us out online. If anyone is interested in the work we do at the John Howard Society and want to know more, please contact us. We're looking always for volunteers. And if anyone is interested in joining the board of directors, reach out and apply, and we'll certainly happily take a look at it.
Awesome. Thanks, Conor. Danya, anything you want to throw out there before we call it a day?
Oh, gee. You know what? I think I'm all talked out. I certainly appreciate you having me on. I love the opportunity to get our messaging out there. I think in this line of work, awareness is such a big piece. There are so many people who live in violence and don't really know who we are, how to get to us. Our website it's the letters for Family Violence Prevention Services, so fvps.ca. And it's one of the better gateways into what we have on offer. And I think it's really great that you had me on.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you sharing all the information you did. I think it was helpful because there could be a misconception about what you do or sort of the limits of what you do. And so many of those programs are so beneficial to folks out there. And hopefully now there's better information about what that looks like and people can come access the variety of services through your website.
Yeah, great.
Okay, well, thank you both for jumping on. Thank you out there for everybody to listening. Our next episode will be Friday, August 23rd at 11. So we'll be back in the heat of the summer to jump in one more time with another great guest. In the meantime, as Conor said, you can find everything for this on the YouTube channel, John Howard Society of PEI, and our website and Facebook. So thanks again to everyone, and take care, and we'll talk soon.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, Danya.
Bye-bye.